It's the age-old question, what the heck do you do with hardtack? Because biting into it ain't in the cards. Well, during the American Civil War, they'd make hellfire stew. A big thank you to Wondrium for sponsoring this video as I test the strength of my teeth and my stomach with hellfire stew from the American Civil War. This time on Tasting History. So one of the main ingredients in hellfire stew is hardtack. And as it happens, last year I made some hardtack and I still have quite a bit left over, so that's what I'm going to be using. Now this is actually called a ship's biscuit. They are one and the same. Hardtack was a term that was used later during the American Civil War. There are differences between this version and what would have been used in the Civil War. This one is based off of what would have been made in the British Navy in the 19th century, and there are a few differences. First of all, the shape. This was meant to be kept in barrels, whereas Civil War hardtack was meant to be kept in boxes, so it was square to make it easier to ship. Then there's also the size, mostly in how thick it is, because these tended to be 4 to a pound, these tended to be between 8 and 10 to a pound. Then the last difference is all whole wheat, not as much whole wheat, and that's about it. Essentially, they're the same though, especially for our purposes. So I'm going to use a little bit of both. But I'm guessing that the year-old hardtack will actually taste better because, like a fine wine, hardtack gets better with age, or if not gets better, then at least develops in taste on account of the worms. I have often seen hundreds, nay thousands, shaken out of a single biscuit. We in the cabin have, however, an easy remedy for this, by baking it in an oven not too hot, which makes them all walk off. But this cannot be allowed to the ship's people, who must find the taste of these animals very disagreeable, as they every one taste as strong as mustard. Sadly, no worms found their way into my hardtack, so I will just have to pretend. Now today's recipe comes from the diary of William Bircher, who was a drummer boy in the 2nd Regiment Minnesota Veterans Volunteers. When, as was generally the case on a march, our hardtack was broken into small pieces in our haversacks, we soaked these in water and fried them in pork fat, stirring well and seasoning with salt and pepper, thus making what was commonly called a hell-fired stew. Pretty darn simple, as is most of the food that they were eating, but we will go into that later. But for this recipe, what you'll need is some pork grease. Now they would have had several options for pork fat. First and most common was salt pork, but sometimes they did get cured bacon, so that's what I'm going to be using. 1, because it's going to taste better, and 2, because then you don't have to get rid of all the salt. A bit of salt, and a bit of pepper, and of course hardtack, which is just flour, water, sometimes a little bit of salt, that is baked until it's rock hard. And like I said, I did this a year ago and I made a video on it, so if you want to learn how to make the hardtack, I will put a link to that in the description. And as it happens, last year that video was sponsored by the Great Courses Plus, and this year's video is sponsored by Wondrium, which used to be the Great Courses Plus. So big surprise here, I love learning, and whether I'm cooking in the kitchen or playing with my Lego, that learning comes in the form of lectures on Wondrium. They have an extensive library of educational videos taught by experts in their field on every topic from science, self-improvement, art, travel, and of course, history. There's this great lecture series called the American Civil War, and in one of the lectures on prisoner of war camps, I learned that Union and Confederate soldiers would sometimes end up in the POW camp of their own side, and I was like, what? Well, it all came down to prisoner exchanges. Basically, if we had 100 prisoners and you had 100, then you'd swap and no harm, no foul. But if one side had more than another, then those extra prisoners would sign a pledge not to return to the battlefield. Sometimes they'd go home, but sometimes they would be held in their own side's prison until they had other prisoners that they could exchange. Ain't that a kick in the pants? And for more kicks in the pants, or at least interesting tidbits like this, you can start your free trial of Wondrium today by clicking the link in the description, or just visit wondrium.com/tastinghistory. Now let's get pounding up this hardtack. So you're not looking to bust this up into flour per se, but you want it fairly fine, maybe a few larger pieces, but you want it pretty fine so it will thicken. Best thing to do is to stick it in a bag and hit it a few times with whatever blunt instrument you have on hand. Okay, so they both took some pounding to bust up, but the year-old ship's biscuit was a heck of a lot harder, and I don't know if it's because of the age or because it is thicker, but that took a lot of work. It's kind of crazy how hard this stuff is, but not for long, because you're going to put it into a bowl and pour some water over it, and in just a couple minutes it'll soak it up and be softer. Now, the soldiers ate this hardtack so much that they quickly got got sick and tired of it, and one of the ways that they would vent their frustration was to write parody lyrics to other popular songs about how much they hated hardtack. One was the Stephen Foster song Hard Times. Let us close our game of poker, take our tin cups in our hand, while we gather round the cook's tent door, where dry mummies of hardtack are given to each man. Oh, hardtack, come again no more. 'Tis the song of the soldier, weary, hungry, and faint. Hardtack, hardtack, come again no more. And the author of our recipe, the drummer boy, lamented, Our hardtack were very hard. We could scarcely break them with our teeth. Some we could scarcely fracture with our fist. But he said that it did furnish quite a bit of nourishment once they could figure out how to get to it by doing things like making hellfire stew. Thus we saw what truly vast and unsuspected possibilities resided in this innocent-looking 3.5-inch square hardtack. 3 made a meal and 9 were a ration, and this was what fought the battles for the Union. Pretty good endorsement as long as it is edible, and to do that, it's going to take some pig grease. So heat up your grease and then add the soaked hardtack into the pan, sprinkle a little salt and pepper on it, and stir it around until it browns. It only should take a couple minutes, which is plenty of time to hit the like button, make sure you're subscribed to Tasting History, and listen to me talk to you about what else a Civil War soldier might eat. Now, any talk of what a Civil War soldier might eat comes with a whole barrel of caveats. Were you an officer? Were you Union or Confederate? Where in the country were you fighting? What time of year was it? And how far into the war was it? And of course, were you wounded or captured? Last year I did a video on what you might eat in a Union hospital, and frankly, it was not too bad food compared to what everybody else was getting. On the other end of the spectrum, if you were in Andersonville, you'd be lucky to be getting anything. So with that in mind, I'm going to be focusing on what your average Union soldier would get if they got what was due to them. In his memoir, aptly named Hardtack and Coffee, John Billings of the Army of the Potomac claimed that they rarely went without any kind of rations. They were pretty well fed. As to the quality of those rations, that was a little bit more variable. So much so that when they got salt beef, they questioned where it actually came from and would call it salt horse. He goes so far as to claim that the food inspectors of the Army were actually in cahoots and taking bribes from the contractors who were giving them the poor quality rations. And no language can be too strong to express the contempt every patriotic man, woman, and child must feel for such small-souled creatures, many of whom are today rolling in the riches acquired in this way. But provided everything was on the up and up, the soldier in camp should expect to get some variation of salt pork, fresh beef, salt beef, rarely ham or bacon, hard bread, soft bread, potatoes, an occasional onion, flour, beans, split peas, rice, dried apples, dried peaches, desiccated vegetables, coffee, tea, sugar, molasses, vinegar, candles, soap, pepper, and salt. Mind you, they didn't get all of that every day. It was always some variation, kind of came piecemeal, and that was only if they were encamped. If they were marching, they got 1 pound of hard bread, 3/4 of a pound of salt pork, or 1 1/4 pounds of fresh meat, sugar, coffee, and salt. So it was important that when you were in camp, you saved a little bit of that ration back for those days that you were out marching. And there are a few reasons why those two rations were so different. First was that the supply train was often well behind the majority of the marching army. Another was that while they often brought herds of cows with them, they needed to set up camp in order to slaughter and butcher them for meat. Now, to break down some of these rations and discuss what the men made of them, we should start with the staple, hardtack. According to John Billings, there were actually 3 kinds. The first was the kind that was so hard that you really couldn't eat it. This was the best kind. The drummer boy who wrote our recipe claims that the hardness came from its age. For there was a common belief among the boys that our hardtack had been baked long before the beginning of the Christian era. This opinion was based on the fact that the letters BC were stamped on the cracker boxes. BC likely stood for Brigade Commissary, or else the company that provided them. The other 2 types of hardtack were soggy and moldy, usually because of bad storage, and ones infested with worms, maggots, and weevils. And if a man got either of these types, they were supposed to be able to take them back and swap them out for some good hardtack, provided there was any good hardtack left, and provided that they knew that it was bad, because in the dark, it could be hard to tell. And it was no uncommon occurrence for a man to find the surface of his pot of coffee swimming with weevils after breaking up hardtack into it, which had come out of the fragments only to drown. Though he says that once skimmed off, they left no discernible taste. But even if you had the best kind of hardtack, you had to do something to it to make it edible. And the drummer boy says that there were 15 distinct ways of doing this. One, of course, was our stew today, the hellfire stew. Another was called skilly-gally, and they're actually very, very similar, though it was described as a dish to make the hair curl, and certainly was indigestible enough to satisfy the cravings of the most ambitious dyspeptic. Another dish was lobscouse, which was basically like a stew, depending on what you had laying around, that was then thickened with the hardtack. And it actually doesn't sound that bad, according to John Townsend, who made it on his wonderful show Townsend's, and seemed to like it. But as palatable as lobscouse sounds, there's another concoction that sounds a little bit less so, and that was if you were out marching and didn't have time to make a fire, but were really, really hungry and willing to risk your teeth, then they would eat hardtack in the raw state. In order, however, to make them somewhat more palatable, a thin slice of nice fat pork was cut down and laid on the cracker, and a spoonful of good brown sugar put on top of the pork, and we had a dish fit for a soldier. Of course, the pork was raw and had just come out of the pickle. Sugar, yay. Raw salted pork, nay. Now, if they didn't want to eat it like that, or if they didn't want to soften it by mixing it up with some grease or some coffee, then they pounded them to a powder, mixed this with boiled rice, and made griddle cakes and honey, minus the honey. But perhaps the most impressive dish that they would make with hardtack was called hardtack pudding, and they would pound it until it did become a flour, and then they would mix that with a little bit of wheat flour and water, and made a stiff dough, which we next rolled out on a cracker box lid like a pie crust. Then we covered this all over with a preparation of stewed dried apples, dropping in here and there a raisin or two, just for auld lang syne's sake. Then they'd wrap this in a cloth and boil it like any other pudding, and it would be served with wine sauce, though the wine was usually omitted and hunger inserted in its stead. Now, as versatile as hardtack was, they did have other options. One was a small, round, white bean that they simply called the army bean. And while the drummer boy admits that it's not as versatile as the hardtack, the one great dish which might be made of it was so preeminently excellent that it threw hellfire stew and hardtack pudding quick into the shade. That dish was baked beans, and I have to admit, baked beans is one of my favorite foods, though today it usually does have sugar in it, and the way that they made it was simply with beans, water, pork fat that was left to slowly simmer in a pot overnight on hot coals. Now, if you were set up in camp for a little while and the supply lines were running as they ought to be, then the food did get quite a bit better. First of all, you had access to that fresh meat and to a lot of fresh bread. When encamped, they would build ovens, and a lot of them. When the Army was encamped outside of Petersburg, Virginia, General Grant ordered the civilian bakers at City Point to tend those ovens, and they would bake 123,000 loaves of bread every single day. Now, all of these rations, whether it's the hardtack, the pork, the beans, or the coffee, everything came in really large quantities, usually meant for 100 or more men in big sacks and big boxes. These would then be given to the orderly sergeant for a company who was in charge of doling them out evenly to the men. And it seemed the most popular way to do this was to lay out a big blanket and then put all of the rations in little piles for each man. And to prevent any charge of unfairness or injustice, the sergeant would turn his back on the rations and take out his roll of the company. Then someone else would point to a pile and ask, "Who shall have this?" And the sergeant, without turning, would call a name from his list. William Bircher, our drummer boy, gives a kind of a sad account of how this process changed throughout the course of the war. At the beginning, it took quite a long time because they had 100 men in the company and they had a lot of rations coming in. But after we had been in the field a year or two, the call, "Fall in for your hardtack," was leisurely responded to by only about a dozen men, lean, sinewy, hungry-looking fellows, each with his haversack in hand. So there is so much more information on this topic that I could cover. I'm not going to because this video I think is already getting quite long, but I am going to cover specifically coffee, Civil War coffee, in an upcoming drinking history video, so be on the lookout for that. But for now, it's time to try our hellfire stew. So once it's well browned, just take it off the fire and serve it up. And here we are, hellfire stew from the American Civil War. Not gonna lie, looks like dog food. Premium dog food, but dog food. Smells pretty good though. It smells like bacon grease. Let's give it a chance. That's really weird. So the texture is really weird. gonna get stuck in every crevice of your mouth. It actually, the flavor is not that bad. It kind of reminds me of chorizo, but really much drier and crumblier. If you add even more fat, it might adhere a little bit better, but even then, I think it's gonna be crumbly no matter what. I use quite a bit of fat in this. The thing is, the hardtack soaks up everything. It needs liquid, so water, grease, just add more. But overall, it's not that bad, and if I was really, really hungry and hadn't eaten that much and had just gone on a 20-mile march, I'd gladly eat this. So make sure to follow me on Instagram, Tasting History with Max Miller, and I will see you next time on Tasting History.